Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to our event this evening. My name is Eric Arneson. I'm a professor of history in the Columbian College, and I am the Vice Dean for Faculty and Administration in the Columbian College as well. It is my honor this evening to welcome you on behalf of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences to this event this evening on religious freedom in a conflicted age, which is sponsored by the Ambassador John L. Loeb Institute for Religious Freedom here at the George Washington University. The Institute was created or formed here at GW last year and is now fully up and running, and it was formed through the generosity of Ambassador Loeb, whose long efforts to share the history of religious freedom in the United States centered on programming of an educational kind around the 1790 letter of our first president, George Washington, to the congregants of the Newport, Rhode Island Synagogue. And in that letter, he assured the Hebrew congregation that the United States would, quote, give bigotry no sanction. And he added that everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and that there shall be none to make him afraid, unquote. This message of religious tolerance and freedom was one that echoed over the decades and captured an important strand in the American tradition, a strand that competed with an equally powerful and, unfortunately, at times, more powerful tradition of religious bigotry and intolerance. And even today, those two traditions of religious freedom and religious intolerance continue to define our nation. And this evening, just over 24 hours after our recent election, I believe that the mission of the Loeb Institute and its message of the importance of the tradition of religious freedom is, alas, more important than ever. Sam?
Well, I'd like to thank Dean Arneson for his gracious welcome on behalf of the Columbian College, and also to thank you for joining us at the end of what has been a roller coaster of a week, whatever your political views happen to be, and also what I'm told is a heavy evening of traffic. So I'm very grateful for your attendance. I'm also pleased to be able to introduce Ambassador David Saperstein as the inaugural lecturer to the Loeb Institute. Ambassador Saperstein's resume is long, so I will not rehearse it in full, but I do want to mention a few highlights. And I'll begin by explaining something about Ambassador Saperstein's position, because I was just chatting in the lobby and somebody said, I didn't know that we had an ambassador at large for religious freedom. And indeed we do. So I can tell you from Ambassador Saperstein's website that the ambassador at large is by law a principal advisor to the President and Secretary of State, and serves as the United States chief diplomat on issues of religious freedom worldwide. So there is some portion of your tax dollars at work. Ambassador Saperstein was confirmed by the Senate to his position in 2014 and began his duties in early 2015. Before beginning his service as ambassador at large, he served for 40 years as director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, where he oversaw national social justice programming for what is the largest segment of the American Jewish community. He is a rabbi and also an attorney, and for the past 35 years, he has taught seminars in First Amendment church-state law and also in Jewish law at the Georgetown University Law Center. So Ambassador Saperstein is well qualified to address us on what is always an important topic, but as Dean Arneson remarks, perhaps today an even more important topic than in the past. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Saperstein.
Well, thank you. The Institute, which opened this year on behalf of religious freedom, could not have chosen a more appropriate leader than you, and I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity through the Loeb Institute to have connected with you and to learn about your own work. I'm delighted to be here at GW. My brother taught here for a decade as the chair of the Jewish Studies program at GW, so I have a deep personal connection as well with GW. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going because it's a small enough group we can actually get some back and forth and interaction. I'm going to kind of mix reading from a text that I had prepared and kind of riffing on condensing a chunk of it to allow for more time for discussion here. And so bear with me as I do that. It's not surprising that religious freedom would be so essential to the foreign policy of the United States because it's so essential to the history, the constitutional foundations, and the ongoing life of the American community. If you turn to the Constitution of the United States, there are 3 clauses dealing with religion. The ban on any religious test for office. And think about what that means. The ban on any religious test for office, the promise of free exercise of religion, and the ban on government establishment of religion. If you take those 3 together, when we founded this country, we came up with a revolutionary vision that had never been known in all of human history. It asserted that one's right as a citizen would not depend upon their religious identity, their religious beliefs, their religious practices. That had never been known in the world before. This is something truly extraordinary. Like many of the promises of our founding documents, we didn't get there immediately. It took us a long time, but by the 1940s, the Supreme Court of the United States had really enshrined these principles, giving a robust interpretation to the Establishment Clause, a robust interpretation to the Free Exercise Clause, a robust interpretation to the concept of separation of church and state. It barred religious groups from exercising any kind of governmental authority and helped bar the government from interfering with religion. There's been a debate for the last 50, 60 years over whether or not establishment of religion is good for religion, the bar against establishment of religion is good for religion or bad for religion. Some would like to have what other democracies have, government funding houses of worship, funding parochial schools. We've gone about it differently. And in the main, it has worked with extraordinary power. That wall that keeps government out of religion has allowed religion to flourish with a diversity and strength in America, unmatched almost anywhere in democratic worlds. Ironically, the 3 most religious democracies, meaning the highest rates of religious belief in God, participation in organized worship, ongoing worship, and organized religious life, are the 3 largest democracies in the world: India, Indonesia, and the United States. But after that, if you measure the religiosity of the people of those democracies across the globe, it falls way, way off by any of those measurements. So it has worked quite well for us. And taking those ideas together, we had to decide that what role they ought to have in international human rights law. And when the founding documents of our current international order, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights were written down, in Article 18 of each of those, we provided that freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, here, including freedom to change religion or belief, the freedom to manifest religion or belief in teaching, the right to practice, to worship, the right of observance. No one shall be subject to coercion, which would impair his or her freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his or her choice. All of that is embodied in Article 18, picking up on America's vision of religious freedom that was absorbed by so many across the globe. The one limiting factor in the ICCPR, however, which is crucial to many of the religious freedom debates that I have to deal with on an ongoing basis in countries across the world that limit religious freedom, allows for the limitation of such freedoms when they are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedom of others. Now, not surprisingly, coercion and legal limitations pose our toughest challenges in our efforts to promote religious freedom. Now, we believe that protecting religious freedom is vital not only because it enables individuals to exercise an internationally protected human right, but it also serves as a driver of peace, security, and development. It is instrumentally important in forging a better world. We advocate for greater respect for religious freedom, therefore, not only for its own sake, because it can help promote peaceful, stable, prosperous societies and advance other goals that we care about, including helping counter violent extremism. In essence, countries benefit when their people can fully enjoy fundamental human rights. No nation can fulfill its potential when its people are denied the right to express their innermost beliefs and to live peacefully in accordance with their conscience. And research from a number of sources show that countries who fail to respect human rights, including religious freedom, and target specific groups, or try to curtail violent extremism by constraining peaceful religious practices, these countries actually become more prone to radicalization of individuals to violence and the emergence of violent extremist organizations. Treating people as second-class citizens because of their religious identity, repressing peaceful expressions of religious belief and communal life for whatever reason, can drive religious life underground, and once underground, these practices become less transparent to the government and can endanger even more social suspicion and rejection. And the anger and frustration and despair of religiously marginalized followers can in turn produce a fertile recruiting field for violent extremists who seek to sow the seeds of hatred and divisiveness. With the First Amendment, the Universal Declaration, the International Covenant, the U.S. in mind, the U.S. passed the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. The IRF Act, as we call it, International Religious Freedom, created the Office for International Religious Freedom and the position of Ambassador at Large. Ambassador at Large merely means an ambassador with global responsibilities. There are 6 of them at the State Department: women's rights, global health issues, drugs, counterterrorism, human trafficking, and the Ambassador at Large position I'm honored to hold on behalf of international religious freedom. We produce an annual report assessing our religious freedom affairs in every country and many territories across the globe. We support programs that nurture religious freedom. One of the few offices that enjoys strong bipartisan support on Capitol Hill. In the 2 years that I've been there, with the support of the Secretary and of Congress, we've doubled the size of my office. My program money has gone from $3.2 million a year that we use to help support human rights structures in countries across the globe, to nurture interfaith coalitions who will stand together on behalf of the religious freedom of all, that will work together to curtail those who would manipulate religion for the purposes of violent extremism. Here we work with civil society to get them to engage more effectively on behalf of religious freedom, of all the basic human rights. A lot of human rights groups are less comfortable dealing with religious freedom than other rights because they don't know what to make of it. If they're not of that religion, they don't, it's hard for them to grasp exactly what's going on. And so we work to help train, and we run training programs in countries across the world using both best practices and practitioners from the global scene, but also our Department of Homeland Security and our Justice Department, together with the Secretary of State staff, to help countries know that there are ways to approach religious differences and tensions without trying to criminalize them and put people who are usually minorities in jail for saying or doing things that may be offensive to religious majorities. And that has had a significantly helpful impact in the work that we do. And of course, I travel the globe, and 2 years I've been there, I've been to about 30 countries, including many that have very serious problems of religious freedom. There are a handful, the North Koreas, Iran, Saudi Arabia. We're not going to change them in the next several years. But there are many who have serious problems of religious freedom who really, we do have the potential to change. I've tended to focus on those countries and have traveled to about 30 countries in the 2 years that I've been there, where I meet with government officials from usually the ministerial or deputy ministerial level, and meeting with them to talk to them about policies that they implement, from the Justice Department to Security Ministry. Always go to the Security Ministry, because a lot of the problems come because countries are scared of religions they don't understand, or scared of people who manipulate religion to inculcate violence, even when the vast majority of those religious groups don't follow them. Often it's used as a reason to control, monitor, repress religion. So I always deal as much as possible with the Minister of Security, the Interior Ministry, if there's a ministry or a committee on religious affairs, with them to try and get them to change policies, ease restrictions. And I meet with civil society leaders and with the religious leaders of almost every group that faces oppression in the country, and then with the religious leaders of the majority religious traditions to try and persuade them to work more cooperatively on behalf of the rights of all religions in the countries. It is hard work. Human rights is not on the ascendancy in the world today. Religious freedom is not in the ascendancy in the world today. But where we make a difference, we touch the lives of millions of people, or we touch the life of one person. That person is a prisoner of conscience, facing death penalties, facing torture, facing long prison terms simply for living out their religious lives in accordance with their conscience. There are countries that ban entire religions. You can't be a citizen of the Maldives and be of any religion other than a Sunni Muslim. You can't be a citizen of Saudi Arabia other than a Muslim citizen, Shia or Sunni, and openly practice your religion. Here, we're working with these countries all the time, and when people get arrested, we often work quietly behind the scenes to try and help some of those people. This year in our annual report, we focus significantly on the issue of blasphemy laws and apostasy laws, and laws against defamation of religion. I mean, I think everyone knows what we're talking about, but let me just say it in a couple of sentences. When we talk about blasphemy laws, we're talking about legislation punishing irreverence or disrespect toward religion, holy personages, religious artifacts, customs, or beliefs. Apostasy laws are laws that threaten to put people in prison, or criminalize the abandonment or renunciation of a particular religious belief, almost always the majority belief of the majority of the population of a given country. Believe it or not, while the United States Supreme Court hold blasphemy laws unenforceable, there are still 6 states in the United States that have blasphemy laws. Massachusetts, Michigan, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Wyoming, Pennsylvania. Any of you from any of those states? Well, you live in a state with blasphemy laws. Here. A lot of the European countries have blasphemy laws. Germany fined somebody who is an avowed atheist for having an anti-Catholic bumper sticker on his car. Here, by definition, blasphemy laws punish people for expressing religious beliefs that are their heartfelt criticism of other religion, or very often without intending to do that, just a manifestation of their core religious beliefs that happen to offend the majority population. So take Ahmadiyya Muslims, who believe that Muhammad was not the last prophet, and that their faith is organized around the belief that far more recently there was a figure who is the Messiah or a prophet. Now that is regarded as blasphemous by normative Sunni Islam and normative Shia Islam. But they're expressing their heartfelt beliefs. They don't do it to provoke or insult other religions, but that's the way it is perceived. And it's kind of a listener's veto to the exercise of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, built into all of these blasphemy laws. And what's even worse is that often these blasphemy laws are used to, not just by governments to crack down on dissenters, but are used in social disputes with false accusations of blasphemy to target people to settle personal disputes over land, resentment against someone from another religion whose son ran off with a daughter of a family that's of the minority religion and accuses the other family of blasphemy. This happens all the time. And in countries like Pakistan, there have been documented issues, and the government has been working more vigorously to crack down on this, of false accusations resulted in people's deaths here, or people ending up arrested and with the possibility of facing mob violence. Here there is a possibility that they will just be held in jail for their own safety for a couple of years until emotions die down and they can be quietly let out of jail again. Well, consider the fate of an Afghan woman named Farkunda in March 2015. As she made her way home from work as a teacher's assistant, she stopped at a shrine in downtown Kabul. She said her prayers and then felt compelled, in our terminology, to preach truth to power in a small and innocent way. She challenged the caretaker of the shrine, Zaimuddin, about selling of charms at the shrine, which she considered to be un-Islamic. The discussion escalated, and the caretaker publicly accused her of being a tool of the Americans and having committed blasphemy by burning a Quran, with absolutely no one else providing any evidence or any physical evidence to justify that accusation. A crowd quickly gathered to hear the incendiary accusations. Blasphemy is punishable by death in some interpretations of Sharia. And although Afghanistan has no explicit blasphemy laws, its constitution states that Islam is a religion of the state and no law can be contrary to the beliefs and provisions of the sacred religion of Islam. Farkunda vehemently denied the accusations and tried to defend herself from increasingly agitated mob. Before long, a member of the mob urged the mob to take justice into its own hands and kill her. Some of the police nearby tried to intervene as the crowd began to beat Farkunda, pull at her clothing. The police officers quickly gave up, however, and watched mutely as the crowd tormented and killed its victims. She was beaten with sticks and boards, kicked, run over by a car, dragged through or thrown into a dry riverbed, stoned and set on fire as bystanders recorded the crime on their phones, and police watch every act of barbarity. She died in torment and in pain sometime during the attack, but the crowd continued to abuse her lifeless body. Now, this is a particular heinous example, but one need only look at recent news stories to find the impact these laws can have on people around the globe. Let me just mention a few of them. Saudi Arabia penalizes blasphemy with lengthy prison sentences and lashings, often after detention without trial or so-called protective custody. In January 2015, authorities publicly lashed Raif Badawi 50 times in accordance with the sentence from his 2013 conviction, calling for 1,000 lashes for violating Islamic values, violating Sharia, committing blasphemy, and mocking religious symbols on the internet. Other poets, bloggers, and activists in Saudi Arabia continue to be charged and imprisoned under these restrictive laws. Indeed, his brother-in-law, the lawyer who is defending him, is now in prison on similar charges. In Nigeria, in June 2015, a Sharia court in Kano sentenced 9 members of a Muslim sect to death for blasphemy for allegedly elevating the group's founder above the Prophet Muhammad. In Pakistan, the government continued to enforce blasphemy laws. Currently, more than 40 people remain on death row for blasphemy in Pakistan. While the majority of those charged with blasphemy are Muslim, a disproportionate numbers are members of religious minorities. Christians as well as Muslims were arrested on charges of blasphemy in this past year. In September, a 16-year-old Christian boy was arrested after he liked an allegedly blasphemous Facebook post. He had to be rushed out of his hearing at the local court when an angry mob appeared and called for his death, a frequent occurrence. We also remain concerned over the authorities targeting and harassment of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community for violations of specific anti-Ahmadi laws as well as for blasphemy. The simple, heartfelt expression of their beliefs ends them up in trouble. Iran continues to execute conscience for their beliefs. This included the mass execution of at least 20 individuals on August 2nd, following conviction for what's called enmity against God. According to the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center database, at least 260 members of minority religious groups remain imprisoned, including Sunnis, Baha'is, Christians, and Yarsanis. Yarsanis are like Yazidis, are in nearby Iraq. Shia religious leaders who did not support government policies continue to face intimidation and arrest. And we are working very hard to persuade countries to find other ways of dealing with speech that the majority may find offensive. And we are having some success through the training programs that we are doing in this regard. I had the privilege of being in the courtroom in Khartoum when a courageous judge set free the 2 most prominent religious prisoners of conscience, 2 pastors, who had simply stood up to defend the right of their church here, and were arrested on an array of charges, some of which might have had the death penalty. And the judge decided there was not enough evidence to sustain any of the felony charges, convicted them of a minor misdemeanor charge, argued that the Quran argues for compassion in such a case, and set them free for time served. So there, in every country, there are efforts to help address the plight of those who are prisoners of conscience. And we are constantly raising these concerns with the people who we visit here. We see increasing levels of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe in many areas across the globe, and that remains a source of significant concern to us. Let me just give you an example, simply because this week is going to be an historic week on the issue I'm going to address. Vietnam. Vietnam was one of those countries that had a fairly repressive system of registration requirements, and countries use registration requirements to keep control over different groups. And if they don't meet the registration requirements, it gives them a justification anytime they want to crack down on the group, arrest its leaders, disband services, and remains a constant source of frustration. Vietnam had an even more complex set of laws, which is not unusual. China, a number of other countries have it, in which the government had to approve everything that even the recognized religions did. So a church wanted to hold Sunday morning services, like they do every year, wanted to observe Easter, wanted to observe Christmas, wanted to observe Good Friday. A mosque wanted to hold Friday services, wanted to observe Ramadan. every one of those acts, every year, had to be submitted for approval at 3 levels of government authorities. And if they didn't get an answer by the time the law said the government had to respond, they were left in limbo. If they moved ahead, they could be in trouble with the authorities. They wanted to send a kid to seminary, needed approval of the government. Wanted to ordain a kid, approval of the government. Wanted to hire a monk in a pagoda, imam in a mosque, a pastor or priest in a church, needed the approval of the government. The bishop wanted to move priests around in order to meet the changing demographics of the churches under the bishop's authority, needed the approval of the government. They passed a new constitution in 2013, and as a result has been considering and passing major kind of omnibus laws on a whole range of issues. And we've engaged in our annual human rights dialogue extensively with them to encourage changes that would give greater freedoms. In some areas, Vietnam has taken the initiative to use this as a way to expand labor rights, to expand disability rights. They signed on to the CRPD, the Covenant for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities treaty. On the other hand, when they did their penal code reform, we were deeply disappointed that there weren't more improvements under that law. Well, they're doing a law on religion, first law they've ever done. Everything has been done under executive orders and executive regulations. This is their first law on religion. And when it began, it was a compilation of all the bad rules and regulations. The only improvement was to be recognized by the government. You no longer had to wait 25 years, you only had to wait 10 years. We don't think you have to wait at all, but we acknowledge that that was an improvement. Other than that, there was not a single improvement. But to their credit, they put out drafts of the law to their own communities for response and to the international community. They are putting together a team of internationally respected lawyers to fly over there, and we kept our hands out of it. We just facilitated it, but these lawyers used their experience, their wisdom to evaluate the law, to show the best practices in other countries, to show how problems that they were concerned about could be handled in ways that would be less intrusive to the religious freedom of their people. And together, the recommendations of the religious communities in the country and the recommendations of international scholars and the international community from outside led to a number of changes. It went through in draft 2, and draft 3, and draft 4, and draft 5, and then I don't know enough about Vietnamese culture to understand why it went to draft 5A, 5B, and 5C, and then on to draft 6, draft 7, draft 8. Here it's now on draft 9 or 10. Here, and step by step, in almost every draft there have been improvements. And they did this on their own terms, within their own values, in accordance with their own laws. Not an effort of anyone imposing anything on them, but because they were willing to engage and listen to different ideas. What they are facing now are, I would say, in the spectrum of where they began and where, by our standards, we would hope they would be there, halfway there. There are still very serious problems, particularly in the rural areas, the central highlands, the ethnic areas, the Hmong and areas, and some of the other rural areas and ethnic areas of the country. But this is light years away from what it was before. And they're about to vote on this on November 17th. This could be a truly historic thing. It is a very influential country. If it actually goes through with these expanded freedoms, they've pulled back from in some of the drafts, but in the main, they have kept expanding the number of different freedoms. No longer, what we argued to them on their security issues were, they didn't need an approval system. We don't think that religious groups ought to have to report their activities to the government. They claim, for security reasons, they need to know what all non-NGOs are doing. So we said, you will know exactly as much information if you have a notification system as you will if you have an approval system. If you want to know, then require them to report, but let them just go on and do their activities. Kind of like the way under United States law, NGO groups other than religious groups who are exempt from this requirement, NGO groups have to report under lobbying law their lobbying activity with the government. Government doesn't approve what they did. It just looks to be sure no law has been violated on the same grounds as any other law would be enforced. Here, you just have to report on what you do. And that's it, in order to have transparency. Here, that's the kind of system they had. So now, a kid goes to seminary, just report it. They get ordained, just report it. The bishop wants to move someone around, just report it. They still need approval for all the core activities I talked about the first year they do it. But once they do it, from that year on, all they have to do is report it. It is like, I told the bishop in the Central Highlands that he no longer had to do. He said, this was the single biggest problem I had. I couldn't assign my priests where I needed them. Some bureaucrat had to make a decision whether that was a good move or not in the government structure. Sometimes people know nothing about this diocese and what goes on here, et cetera. So this is a really significant improvement in the Vietnamese government. We'll continue to push them to make changes and to address remaining issues, but it is a significant improvement that they deserve a lot of credit for. Here, so this is an example of something remarkable. I would just identify one issue. I won't take the time to spell out now, but it would be wrong for me not to say something about it. If we have a number one priority, it is all of the effort that the State Department and the United States government, its military, its intelligence sources, its aid programs are involved with to allow those who have been the victims of genocidal activity and ethnic cleansing by Daesh, by the non-state actors in the Middle East, forced to leave their historic homelands where they've lived often for 1,800 years of unbroken religious life on the Nineveh Plain in Mosul and areas. And the secretary, as you know, reached a finding that against the Yazidis, against the Christians, against the Shia Muslims, that Daesh had engaged in genocide and in ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity, against the full range of other minority groups that have been victims of their brutality. We are deeply focused and engaged in doing what needs to be done to allow those groups to return to their historic communities. It is a daunting task. You need security. You need accountability to try those who were the perpetrators, and not just the members of Daesh, but people in the communities after when Daesh came in who were complicit with Daesh and working with Daesh. And then what do you do about people who come home to find that former neighbors have taken over their houses, their businesses, perhaps invested in them? Who has title? And how do you sort out the differences in a way that doesn't plunge the entire region into revenge killings and retribution and new rounds of sectarian violence? How do you rebuild the infrastructure there? Who's going to see the utilities are put together, that there are hospitals that are functional, that there are schools that are functional? People won't go home without all of that. All of that has to be done by the international community and the Iraqi government here. And then there have to be governance issues. Who's going to rule? Very often, because of the changing demographic patterns enforced by Daesh, here other people have filled the governance gap. Are they going to get pushed out and the people have fled, take over all the governance structures? These are complicated issues as well. And how is the Iraqi government going to assure all of these minorities that they're going to have a bigger role in shaping the future of Iraq as a whole? This is an and what do we do to protect the cultural heritage that Daesh has not only tried to wipe out people, it's tried to wipe out the entire history of these crimes against humanity and crimes against history that have been wrought by Daesh. What's going to be done to restore the damage done to the cultural patrimony of the area and to rebuild and protect those sites that still remain? All of this is part of the work that the United States government is engaged in. It is both daunting and exhilarating to be involved in this work. It is true that we see too many people who have been the victims of religious persecution around the world today. The Pew annual survey on this subject indicates that 24% of the countries of the world engage in serious violations of human rights. 76% generally are supportive of the rights of people to live out their lives in accordance with their religious conscience. Unfortunately, the 24% of the countries that have very serious problems, either societal tensions and that leads to violence or government restrictions of religious freedom, contains 75% of the population of the world. Because China is in there, India is in there, and I don't compare China and India. They're very, very, very different sets of problems here. But they are the two most populous countries of the world. So the vast majority of countries live in areas which either aren't secure or doesn't provide safety for them, often against societal violence, or is involved in government restriction of religion, such as in China. Here, so this is a daunting agenda. But wherever I travel across the globe, in every country, even the most repressive countries, and certainly those that have societal tensions, it is extraordinary to me to see mosques and synagogues, pagodas and temples filled with people worshiping on an ongoing basis, often in the most tenuous safety environments you can imagine, and still they come, and still they pray, and still they teach their children. That's really something quite extraordinary. And when government restrictions are eased, religious institutions do what they have always done: be a partner with the government in providing core social services, better education, better health care. They feed the hungry. They lead efforts to address area problems of environmental damage. Here, when the power of religious groups is set free, it is such a boon, such a win-win for countries across the globe. That's what we fight for every day. And despite the odds, it is extraordinary what does go on. And the stories of heroism of people who see the violence I talked about Pakistan. We have a score of stories of where mobs have formed and Muslim leaders have, imams and prominent leaders have walked between a mob and somebody accused of blasphemy and talked the mob down, literally saving lives. The extraordinary story in Kenya you may have read about when Al-Shabaab, which has often engaged in terrorist activities and takes over a mall, takes over a bus, in this case took over a bus and did what they often do, tried to separate the Muslims from the Christians and just assassinate all of the Christians on the bus. The Muslims refused to identify who was who and refused to separate themselves. The driver and one of the passengers who stood up to them were killed, but then they just turned around and they left, leaving alive everyone else who had been on the bus. There are countless stories of personal courage, of leaders who have made a difference for the better, who have helped bring peace in an atmosphere of violence. I hear all of that is inspiring to our work. So it is a great honor for me to hold this position. How much longer I will hold it, a little uncertain at this particular moment here, but to have done so is the great honor of my life. here, and to know that this is one of the areas where there really is bipartisan support for this cause and for the United States engagement on it leaves me encouraged that however long I'm going to be there, whether it's years or weeks at this point, here there will be others who will carry on this struggle, and America's vision of religious freedom that over the centuries has transformed the world will continue to transform the lives of people of all religions, and those who choose, who are often the victims of prejudice and violence, those who choose no religion are equally protected under this, that they will increasingly survive in the years and decades and centuries to come, and America's gift to the world of religious freedom will more and more become the norm. So thank you very much.
So I thank you too, and you do us great honor by speaking. I'm pleased to say that we have some time for questions, and I'll just offer two guidelines. First, I'll ask you, if you want to ask a question, to come up to the microphone between the aisles so that we can hear it. Second, I'm going to exercise my prerogative as director to establish a Loeb Institute tradition, which is for a student to ask the first question. So please come up to the microphone, and the first student to reach it gets the
Well, you know, I talked about acts of bravery. Asking the first question is its own form of act of bravery, and once it happens, then others do it. So who's going to be the brave student here to start us off? Thank you.
So,
Why don't you identify yourself?
hello, my name is Barrett Young, and I'm a member of Professor Goldman's Politics and Values program. And my question has to do with what happens this next 4 years. So we're recently seeing the United States increase in hate-based violence against Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and we now have a president who is not popular around the world because of certain statements made of religious minorities. How is the election of Donald Trump going to affect our diplomatic efforts to promote religious freedom around the world?
The first question I get asked whenever I travel around the world also here. First, we're constrained from commenting on, partisan political matters. So just, hear what I'm going to say, understanding that I just face that restriction. I wouldn't, in my old job, I would not have hesitated to make a comment. So several points. First, during a political campaign, a candidate can say anything that they believe, anything they think will be politically expedient and helpful then to say. They can be as provocative as they want to be. They can call for any policy that they want. The minute they are sworn in as the President of the United States, whether the name is Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or anyone else, the minute they are sworn in, they are bound by the Constitution of the United States and the constraints that the Constitution imposes on them. One of those constraints is you cannot single out protected categories of people for treatment or behavior or actions that wouldn't apply to any similarly situated group. So you can't single out religious groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, groups of national origin, et cetera, by dint of those characteristics for treatment different than anything else. So, that's point one. Point two. We have very serious problems about racial tensions in the United States and ethnic tensions in the United States and religious tensions. I would just offer a word of perspective here. If you look at the FBI statistics on the number of hate crimes in America, please consider that, by percentage, we've seen two spates of hate crimes against Muslims in which it was an increase of 50% over the prior year. One was in 2002 after 9/11 had taken place, and the other is in this past year. But what we're talking about is 200 to 300 hate crimes a year. The vast majority of those are nonviolent hate crimes. Harassment, someone yelling something at someone, being harassed on the internet by someone, or taking paint and putting a swastika on a synagogue, or writing something about Muslims or blacks or gay people on a building or in the sidewalk, et cetera. There are very few physical attacks in the United States, which are far more common in other countries across the world when hate crimes happen. Now, I don't for a minute poo-poo the significance of those nonviolent hate crimes. Here, if you are walking along as a Muslim with your child and that child sees hateful things that have been scrawled on their sidewalk, it is a terrifying experience, and it makes everyone in that community feel vulnerable. And I certainly don't minimize, just because it happens rarely, what happens when the James Byrds and the Matthew Shepards and the victims of physical attacks are attacked. But I do ask us to remember that there are 330 million Americans, and the number of hate crimes against religious groups is fairly small. I mean, there are twice as many against Jews in the United States. Actually, 57% of all religious hate crimes are against Jews in the United States. Muslims are second in that. The group of any protected group that far and away the most are against African Americans here. But of the religious communities, twice as many, and even there, you're talking, depending on the year, 600, 700. Here, it is horrible. There's a single one of those. But if you compare it to, population-wise, to the hate crimes that take place in France or in other European countries, here it is far less, and far less serious crimes than they have there. So, this is a terrible thing that it happens. Here, if there's anything I'm troubled by, I shouldn't say I'm troubled by all of this. The final thing I would say about this campaign is that in America, we have succeeded in the last century of imposing significant social and cultural constraints on the expression of, or the action against people. That's why there's so few of these. And even where freedom of speech protects hate speech in the United States, we believe you drown out hate speech with good speech. You don't do it by throwing people in jail. And we differ from other democracies that see that differently. So if you consider there are still tens of millions of people, according to the polling data, who still hold anti-Semitic attitudes, anti-black attitudes, right? The fact that there are so few who actually act on it is one of the great successes of America. The power of the social constraints against expression of that has been one of our extraordinary achievements. In this campaign, the lifting of some of those cultural constraints is deeply alarming. When leaders of the country are willing to lift those constraints, willing to engage in making fun of groups or people from groups or protected categories, you're accusing whole groups of crimes here rather than individuals for crimes. And it is, that it's hard to to close that Pandora's box. Here. No one knows what we're facing in this regard. Obviously, if as President Donald Trump sets an example of restrained expression in dealing with all of these protected groups, this may be a blip that went away, but it may not be, even if he does. It may have changed American politics in a way in which the lesson is that you get something from doing this. And we may see other leaders do it. So this is a fragile moment on the issues you're asking about here. But when I go to areas of the world and say, why are you talking to us about our problems and tensions? Look at what's happening to African Americans in the United States. Look what's happening in terms of political leaders saying things about different groups. I'll point out to them first, the reason you know about that is we have an absolutely free press, including for your press. We never try and hide this. We never try and drive it underground. Here it gets debated. We look for ways to solve these problems. That freedom of free marketplace of ideas allows us, so it means that there are things that are painful that can be said, but allows the country to respond, and responsible civic, religious, political, civil society leaders to respond effectively to these things. And then I'll remind them of how rare this has been in American life. With all the problems that we have. I mean, I still think with all of this, the issue of race remains the great challenge for America. That is a distinct challenge in America. So I don't minimize for a second. I will pray for and act for the day that there's not a single hate crime against anybody in America, and will not be satisfied until that happens. But I do urge countries across the globe to see what happens here in perspective. We don't have the Facundas, happening on the streets of America. That is an unknown phenomenon, thankfully, in our country, and we should take pride in that even while we address the problem that you talk about.
Thank you.
What's your name?
Josiah Augustine.
Okay.
Let me turn this microphone on. All right, so...
I think people can hear you.
Okay.
So, yeah.
My specialty is in the Balkans, and I noticed there, especially where you're dealing with issues of religion, it's not usually disentangled from other issues that are not just purely religious or issues of religious expression, because they happen in the context of intergroup problems between ethnic groups, thinking, for example, in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia with the Albanians. So there you do have a Muslim minority, but it's also an ethnic minority. And so politics oftentimes between these groups is very contentious, or say the Turks in Greece or the Slavophonic Muslims in Greece and all across the world. There are similar situations. How does your office take a different approach to places where these issues intersect, where we're not just dealing with maybe a mono-ethnic state that has repression of other religions, but where leaders really have an incentive to persecute religious minorities because it's part of an overall struggle between two very distinct groups, linguistically, religiously, culturally, etc. What different approach do you take?
A very important and sophisticated question. It is actually fairly rare to have a purely religious dispute. You remember when I told you that, in Pakistan, these false accusations because of economic differences, fights over businesses or fights over personal relationships and that kind of thing. Even at that level, there's a mixture of different things. A vast majority of tensions that arise and violence that breaks out is not the majority, a significant minority that are purely religious-based, but very often certain ethnic groups have a common religion different from other ethnic groups. The battle may be over lands. I mean, think of Nigeria and the battles between the Fulani Muslim herdsmen, who are nomadic tribes moving through areas settled by Christians here who are farmers. Here, you remember the range war disputes in the United States, reading about the range war disputes in the United States between the sheep herders and the farmers and the cattle drivers and the farmers. Here you find the same kind of disputes going on all the time. But when one group is of a religious identity, often the target will be at that core of their identity. And so houses of worship are being burned and people are being driven out. And it doesn't matter that, that it's a complex network of reasons. Here they can't live their religious life. When you think of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma, here, which the world is watching again at this point. Here, these million Muslims who are of a particular ethnic group, different from Muslims in other areas of the country, and there are fights over land, there are fights over political involvement, there are fights over the question of what citizenship means in the country. You can't really be effective in responding to those unless you recognize the network of economic issues, of ethnic issues, of political issues. Here, and again, I come back to financial issues of one kind or another that get mixed into all of these disputes. But from the standpoint of my office, from the standpoint of religious freedom advocates in countries across the globe, it doesn't matter. In other words, if the end result is people can't live their religious lives freely, safely, and able to engage in the core activities of what religious freedom guarantees, it's an issue for us to deal with. How we deal with it will only be effective if we take that sophisticated understanding of the interwoven network of a lot of causes that transparent. I don't know whether you caught Carlotta Gold's extraordinary story about Kosovo here, in which she talked about the influence of Wahhabi, often funded by Saudi Arabia's presence in Kosovo, that had really radicalized Kosovo's Muslim community in a way that had been very moderate, pro-American, and it's changed substantially. I've heard similar patterns in Bosnia talked about as well. But if you didn't catch it, it was in the Times front page story, and then a full two-page spread about it. It sounds like these are things you're interested in. I really commend that to you. It is a kind of case study of many of the interwoven network of causes that you have talked about. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for speaking to us tonight. My name is Arthur Peskin. I'm also a member of Professor Goldman's Politics and Values program. You had mentioned the growing wave of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe, and I want to know what your office's approach to that trend was, and as well as does that approach differ from your office's approach to, say, the Middle East or other areas of religious conflict, because of the democratic nature of your
I mean, it's a variant of the question we just had. In other words, you have to take every country as it is. You have to understand what its culture is, what the economic issues are, what the political system is, and what opportunities that political system has to empower civil society to play a role or represses civil society and prevents them from playing a role. Does it have a structure of a rule of law, or does it not? Are people able to go to the courts? Is there a free media that can lift up these stories and challenge editorially challenge their country to come to grips with it and stand up for the vulnerable minority group that may be unpopular and has been victimized by it? So you have to look into all of those problems. At the State Department, we have a special office on a special envoy about combating anti-Semitism, and we have a special envoy to the Muslim communities of the world, and a special representative to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Here we have my office that has about 25 full-time people, some part-time people, and we have the office that the Secretary just created to strengthen our efforts to engage with religion in broader foreign policy issues, called Religion and Global Affairs. It also has a staff of about 25. So altogether, and this is actually something extraordinary, there are about 50 to 60 people at the State Department in Washington who are working full-time on religion issues. There's probably more than all the rest of the world put together. Here it is really something extraordinary that we have that. But we pride ourselves, the offices assigned to religion issues in other democracies across the globe, on the international, and many countries have offices and committees on religious affairs regulating religion in their country. I'm talking about our counterparts fighting for international religious freedom as a foreign policy priority. We're very proud of the international cooperation that we have on these issues. And when we turn to an area like Europe, here there are obviously legal remedies that are possible. There's robust civil society pushing political leaders to stand up, strengthening interfaith coalitions so that religious groups who are attacked are not standing alone, but have the support of other religious communities. Vitally important, and that may be impossible in other areas. There may not be diverse religious populations, and where there are, the minority groups may have no standing to actually participate and talk about issues generated by the majority in the country. So every place is different. We've spent a lot of effort on addressing the issues cooperatively with our European allies, the issues of the growth of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Here, again, I offer even there, keep it in perspective. This is not 1939. Here, the majority of Jews still believe they have a future in Europe. They want to stay there. The governments have gone over backwards, not just to denounce it, but if you travel through Europe, you can visit almost any synagogue, any Jewish institution, and some Muslim institutions, depending on the circumstances where they are, you'll find government guards that have been provided. Here, you'll see government efforts to educate people about minority religion. You'll see steps by government to try and address these problems. Where in other areas of the world where anti-Semitism exists, you won't have the same level of cooperation to address these issues. So we're not alone in this fight, and in Europe, we really do have a lot of key allies here.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's the last question we have time for, but that does not mean the conversation has to end. So please join me in thanking Ambassador Loeb. I'll invite you to exit into the lobby where there is food, wine, and further discussion.
Let me just say before we go, here, and you were very gracious in helping to facilitate this. Here, I'm going to stick around for a few minutes. I have the opportunity to say hello and answer questions. I can't stay long. I actually have been asked to do a tribute to a dear friend of mine who's getting an award in the Congressional Visitors Center, and I have to be down there by 8 o'clock. So I'll be around for a few minutes. Please accept my apologies. I thank you all for coming. And for those of you who really care about these issues, I really want to commend to you thinking seriously about careers that will involve foreign affairs, as foreign service officers, as civil service employees in the international realm working for USAID in terms of development work and humanitarian relief work. There are international agricultural service and a whole range of cultural international entities that the United States government has for people who care about these international issues. You're in Washington, D.C., and it takes very little effort. There will be sources, I'm confident, here at the Elliott School, which will be able to help guide you to some of these career opportunities. And I really hope that some of you will be part of the extraordinary partnership that exists by committed people like you who help take America's values and affirm America's interests in a constructive way across the globe. And if you get stuck in finding it out, you can always email me at saperstein@state.gov. Thank you very much.